When the farthest corner of the globe has been technically conquered and can be economically exploited. When any incident you like, in any place you like, at any time you like, becomes accessible as fast as you like. When you can simultaneously experience an assassination attempt against a king in France and a symphony concert in Tokyo. When time is nothing but speed, instantaneity, and simultaneity. And time as history's vanished from the being of all peoples. When a boxer counts as the great man of a people, when the tallies of millions at mass meetings are a triumph, then, yes then, there still looms like a specter over all this uproar, the question, what for, where to, and what then?
このプロトコル7の採用により、ワイヤードとリアルワールドはシームレスに情報をシェアする環境になるものと期待が持たれています。では次のメッセージです。レインを好きになりましょう。レインを好きになりましょう。レインを好きになりレイン。
There are few shows out there that truly extend outside their medium, in a way that feels meaningful, breaking outside the walls of their own story to try and predict the future or create entropy with reality in a wish to become meta-fiction. Serial Experiments Lain is a show widely discussed in online spaces, but rarely for the reason Heidegger's question points toward, and rarely for the kind of medium breaking I just described, even though it's the show that most particularly excels at both. Simply put, Lain's ideas about the internet's reality or the extension of such a phenomenon have become in modern times meta-fiction. This is a fact that's quite hard to truly quantify and break down properly, but it all starts from within the actual anime. Since it's a vast work covering the concept of the internet from a perspective of identity and consciousness, it was inevitably bound to become a staple of internet culture as well. That cultural reach is only one half of it though, because the strange thing about Lain's metafiction quality is that it's also part of the show's own narrative. In a way, the ideas I've described act completely differently within the context of the anime itself, because they behave as if they were truly real. Not in the science fiction way of science becoming fact, but in a far stranger way that's honestly much harder to understand. So how would I describe it? Well, it's a fundamental difference in Lain's narrative structure. What makes the show different is that these traits it exhibits don't particularly stop at a narrative level. While most fiction works remain contained in their own bounds and can be easily dissected, discussed and even analyzed in the context of the work, there's always a certain distance kept from the work that keeps it from becoming real. Lain is the first show I've witnessed where that certain wall, that distance over time got completely destroyed. To get why this happened to Lain in particular, it's worth pulling back for a second to look at the larger pattern that Lain is sitting inside of.
Within Lain, we find an idea confronted head-on within the context of the Y2K society. This being how our consciousness and the way in which we view our sense of self and our own consciousness may be altered or rewired according to the advent of new technologies, and then extrapolating how this individual experience then extenuates in the broader society. Worldwide internet is certainly not the first time in which we encounter this phenomenon, yet it is certainly the most wide-reaching and consecutively impactful. We may look back at its antecedents in mechanical engineering, the printing press, the written word, and perhaps its earliest ancestor in the wheel. Not simply on their own did these inventions change humanity materially, but they expedited the travel and experiences of man. With the wheel, man built a chariot and spread even more rapidly than he did before, bringing into effect the crossing and intrusion of separate cultures and their own technologies and experiences between each other. With the written word, man could then disembody himself in some way, his experiences diffused into a text which could reach across the world and preserve itself even infinitely. The printing press then made this process streamlined, and the written word could be copied and produced at a greater rate than ever before. Then, with mechanics, we find that we could tell the time within the palm of our hands. The laws of nature became formula, and discovered with it the first recorded transmissions of what was dubbed electricity, and the flow of its electromagnetic waves. All this to say that with each of these, humanity began to, by their own perception, view the world in a radically different way than its predecessors. And with each generation, we seem to become only more aware of how deeply we have been affected this way.
Then, humanity wrote about these afflictions in the form of stories, shows, or even anime. And Lain, more than perhaps any other piece of fiction from its era, is the work that seems to know all of this about itself. Which doesn't only become apparent from the contents of the series, but from how the general public reacted to Lain becoming a cornerstone of internet culture. For example, the phrase repeated throughout the series, "Let's all love Lain," which has now become a fragment of internet scripture in its own right. In the show, it's a phrase that starts as an obvious rise to power of the titular character to an almost cult-like status. It's something people repeat to affirm, to have it become a singular truth above all else. The truth is that they love Lain because of her opposition to the god of the Wired. The more the Wired has of that statement, the closer it drags itself to being an absolute truth. It's of course really easy for such phrases to become the central ideas of fandom culture. The kind of things said by those who are fans or who simply love the show. In a way, the phrase is something akin to a quote from a book or a movie. It first starts as an identifier, where one may say that or have it in their profile to signal their fondness of Lain. But as they exist more and more within the online space, you start to notice certain outliers. People start repeating it unironically, then ironically, and then somewhere in between those two states, the irony of it gets lost entirely. At that point, something changes, and the person doing it no longer sees Lain as just a character. It becomes Lain the Phenomenon.
Beyond mere metafiction, Lain is one who is made to think about its own thinking, her own waking consciousness, and which then invokes the viewer into this process. Just as Lain sees the dolls which bear her likeness and represent the external perception of her by everyone else, this reflects upon us again as yet another viewer. Then, with how it perturbs Lain and the presuppositions of her own selfhood, it entreats us into the same. And so, by thinking our way through the show, and in doing so, back to our own selfhood, we become in essence, Lainists.
Lain isn't the only work this has happened to. You can see the same aspects in a lot of early internet era fiction, but it's the only one I've watched go furthest. The one where the gap between the fiction and the believer has been wrecked entirely. Maybe that's because the show was already about the idea of collapse to begin with, or maybe just because the people most likely attracted to it were the ones wishing to disappear easily into something. Or maybe, who knows, both at the same time. Regardless, this turns easily into a loop which defines the ideals described. This whole video is going to be an attempt at tracing those ideals, where they came and what's left of Lain as the show by the time you finish watching it. There is no clean answer, but this is the Lain phenomenon in a nutshell. A phenomenon that starts exemplifying itself in the vast real-world internet. You begin to see it as an extension of the show itself, in the meta. Message boards, obscure websites, fragmented communities that often appear to outsiders like they are merely engaging in roleplay, but in reality they aren't. These types of communities aren't really a new thing. They have precedents, and a lot of them at that, because all throughout the earlier history of the internet, you can see elements which inherited some of these qualities but never really achieved the level of weirdness I mentioned above. Lain-chan, one of the many chan boards, was originally created just like a lot of other anonymous boards, but with one goal in mind. It was made to stimulate the atmosphere of the Wired. Of course, it was a rather more humanized space than what came afterwards, since people discussed and identified the difference between their fiction and reality. When you can't do that anymore, that's when you get the Tsuki project. One of the more extreme cases of this, but far from the only one. A website masquerading as a belief system built entirely on the ideas of serial experiments Lain. Or maybe, who knows, the other way around. It has this creepy occultish atmosphere that's encapsulated in a very powerful feeling that it was made by individuals rejected by the current century, outliers of the Y2K movement. The site showcases stylistic departures and similarities of that era, background blur, jungle music, and other aspects which give the website a modern feel while simultaneously displaying its knowledge of late 90s counterculture surrounding the internet. It speaks in a language of systems and layers of reality, of ascension through digital means. It tells you this temporary world is just one layer of a structure larger than yourself, and with the right action you can move beyond it. All pretty standard cult things, but most importantly, it's covered in Lain's iconography and terminology. It feels eerily familiar with elements taken directly from the show plastered all over its messaging. Familiarity that does something rather strange in this context. Jean Baudrillard had a word for this kind of drift. When a copy stops pointing back at an original and starts generating its own reality, he called it the hyperreal. The hyperreal is what happens when a representation outgrows the thing it was supposed to represent and starts behaving like it has its own life. The result of that drift in Lain's case is a hyperreal condition inflicted upon Lain herself, where the belief in Lain as the real god to worship becomes the reality of our world. So Lain isn't a character in Serial Experiments Lain anymore. She starts becoming Lain the metaspace, Lain the one that inflicts metatesphobia. Metatesphobia is the fear of being changed, sped up here by the beliefs of mentally ill individuals. It's accelerationist thinking in some regard. It wishes to surpass the limits of the human body as soon as possible and eventually become just an existence on the internet. A wish that someone's grave may become the wires they use to communicate with others, and in that sense, it goes completely against the show's own Lain. This is something I've talked about on this channel before, in my video Lost Media and Death, where I described the internet starting to become a collective graveyard for many who perish in its grasp. So wanting to archive and worship the idea of being encapsulated upon death doesn't seem that strange. It's just the place it's coming from, an anime from the late 90s, which without having any meaning to, created conditions where symbols like this detached from their origins circulated on their own, forming belief systems and communities that no longer needed the original ideas to sustain them. But a symbol unmoored from its origins still needs somewhere to land, and it tends to find the minds most prepared to receive it. And those receivers are what I would call real-life Denpa key. As some of you know, in the past I've made a video on Denpa, and in that video I stated that Lain is one of the most influential Denpa works of all time. The term Denpa-kei is one derivative of Denpa and represents people who publicly declare their absurd delusions and beliefs to those around them, who feel disconnected from reality and dissociated from the people around them because they believe a higher goal lies in a supposed technological existence. All of this is very derivative of the Denpa ideals, the thinking that the internet may be alive and that signals and electricity might have meaning and consciousness beyond what we comprehend as mere flesh beings. People like those who deluded themselves into believing what the Tsuki project preached were exactly that, the real-life Denpa-kei who took their favorite work and combined it with their own lives into one single belief. Except their ideals are the opposite to what Lain preaches. And by extension, when they oppose it, others oppose them as well. Eventually, it turns into a feedback loop that's being propagated between fiction and reality, where each medium starts to invade the other side, until eventually, slowly but surely, people start to confuse their real lives for that of the show. And the most unsettling part of the whole ordeal is that Lain as a show seems to have been conscious that this would eventually happen. It predicted all of this in a way that wasn't literally prophetic, but wasn't far from it either, with the whole idea of the Knights as hackers and the real world becoming encapsulated by a person who is merely a software programmer. A lot of this thematic language had been already formed decades prior to any of these trains of thoughts that would eventually cement themselves in reality. Unreality is a more accurate way to describe what the show is structurally. It is built in such a way that once it enters the real world within the show's universe, it can no longer remain stable, and when it exits that space into our world, it changes further and surfaces in a lot of unexpected places. Even inside Lain, there's this entire discussion about existence and if the wired and real world are truly separate. For those who would believe that maybe online spaces would represent their heaven on earth, they could easily delude themselves into believing they are getting signs from their gods. You can be in the online space, be one of these people who believe the show is their gospel, and stumble upon Keon Palm's album Siberia, for example, which is merely a tribute to the show's overall aesthetics and ideals. But as a deluded person, a Denpa-kei yourself, you'd read into it as a divine sign from the Wired itself. That's the point where analysis to me starts to feel insufficient. It really doesn't work when you're no longer dealing with a text, but a monstrosity outside its own scope. One that takes concepts such as fiction, belief, and delusion and makes them indistinguishable from one another. If Lain in our current context is no longer just a story for some, but a belief that continues to exist outside itself, then what exactly are we engaging with when we talk about it anymore? And more importantly, how far are its reaches? To start answering that, I want to pull from somewhere that might seem counterintuitive at first, because the questions the show raises about connection, death, and what it means to exist in the presence of others have philosophical ideas that predate the internet entirely. Emil Cioran is a Romanian philosopher, whose greatest achievement was the fear of suicide. He was a man driven and constructed so much around the idea of suicide that he asserted the highest wish of life a human can achieve is to be driven by the fear of suicide in a simply perpetual state. In 1934, he wrote a philosophical thesis featuring a variety of short essays named On the Heights of Despair. In one of these essays, in particular titled How Distant Everything Is, he talks about the fear of death and how a certain person might feel in their last moments of life. Friends, ambitions, society, even the idea of being seen at the moment of death. All of these are forms of noise that prevent a person from confronting something more fundamental, the absolute isolation of existence. At first glance, all of these concepts seem to oppose Serial Experiment's Lain idea of the wired, because fundamentally speaking, the wired is an existence that draws closer to a collapse between people's boundaries, a space where nothing is hidden anymore. In theory, this is the exact negation of what Cioran's complaint about being so close to one another pushes back against. The more connected people feel, the less stable their sense of self is. We see that often within the wired as people approach their deaths, because instead of existing as an openness derivative of the depths of soul, they merely become copies of their originals, representing rumors or urban legends. Cioran insists on this. Even if we could see each other completely, that fact alone would not save us. It would drive everyone to a failure of openness. He wonders what would happen if we could read into the depths of each other's soul, but at the same time he undercuts it by returning to isolation as something inescapable.
We would lose everything and gain nothing, for what is there to be gained from this world? There are people to whom gain is unimportant, who are hopelessly unhappy and lonely.
To die alone, without witness, without performance, without illusion is what the people of places like the Tsuki project wanted. But in reality they worked against it, without meaning to. Because they didn't want spectacle to be made out of their deaths, and the wired ends up drawing them into it anyways, since everyone there is connected. If we were to simply be able to be open to each other in death, then our existences would be like an afterlife, haunted by the image of it instead.
The deepest and most organic death is how distant everything is. Death in solitude, when even light becomes a principle of death. In such moments you will be severed from life, from love, smiles, friends, and even from death. And you will ask yourself if there is anything besides the nothingness of the world and your own nothingness.
That's what frightens the self, closeness in spite of the loneliness of forgetting death. In that death, the most obvious concept that comes from Cioran's prose is that of silence. And silence is exactly how the show portrays Lain. Her thoughts are withheld from us for most of the runtime. Lain is silent even though she is the main character. This is an intentional choice to separate the self of the viewer from that of Lain. This is quite different to a lot of shows where the first-person narration is inseparable from the perspective of the character or even an outer monologue. What that does to you as a viewer is genuinely unsettling once you notice it, because you're forced to fill in the gaps yourself. You're constantly reaching towards her, trying to construct some coherent understanding of what she wants to, or feels, or fears, and every time you think you've got it, she slips slightly out of focus again. It leads to confusion and a strange state of admiration that gives her the same induced outer appearance of a cult leader. This is also compounded by the idea that everyone within the show's universe, equivalent of the internet, the wired, sees a different version of Lain herself. It's a consciousness of supreme power, one unreachable. As such, different versions of Lain start forming, not just within the show, but in the mind of the viewer as well.
Within the anime alone, we find a separation between the Lain of the wired and the Lain of the physical world. Throughout the majority of the show, the latter is insisted upon seemingly by Lain herself as being the real Lain, and the former but a copycat of some sort. Though this does represent the dissemination of the self through the internet, and it does function this way, there is a broader significance to it, especially as it is established by the end. Mainly, that Lain's mistake is one in which the viewer is likely making as well, both in our assumptions made based on our memory data provided to us up to that point, as well as commonly presupposed metaphysics. A defining philosophy as it had been carried out since the advent of mechanical engineering was best summed up within the Cartesian dualism of mind and body. The separation between physical matter in the body and the immaterial mind. While this may remain a useful way of interpreting physical and mental events as they come to us, as a viewpoint of human nature, it relies on conveniences of assumption. This separation is carried out from the very start of the series as Lain feels divested of herself through the wired. There then becomes a Lain of the wired who inhabits an immaterial form in contrast to the physical Lain. As the series continues, who Lain is becomes confused to both Lain and us as the viewer. Over time, the physical Lain who we see going out with her friends becomes an alien to us, perhaps more alien to us than that of the Lain of the wired. Within this separation is the struggle between the selves, as the Lain of the wired affects the physical world and the supposed real Lain's social life through her effect on the immaterial realm of the wired. The interaction between these parts then becomes of chief concern and lays bare the compartmentalization of Lain as a person and its basis. She is further morally incentivized to view her wired self as separate from her true self due to the havoc it wreaks upon her social life.
Each Lain is orientationally different. It just so happens that at one point in the series, she stops being treated as a person and starts being seen as a deity or a dios of the wired. That is best exemplified in the second episode. A man enters the Siberia club and begins shooting people. He is on a drug called Acela, which supposedly increases brain capacity by 12 times, but has a side effect of making its user connected to the wired. And what he wants is to be alone, to stop being connected to others, knowing well that the wired should not break into the real world. In the end, Lain freezes, and as he raises the gun to kill her, her alter ego takes over, telling him that
no matter where you are, everyone is always connected.
Which promptly leads to him killing himself, in a wish to once again return to solitude. He also says curiously, "You're that gods," trailing off before the word, which is most likely disciple. This ties quite well into my next point, because we're also aware of the fact Lain hears the voice of the god of the wired, a fact that's shown to the viewer and directly told through this guy's dialogue. But after these two instances, the viewer is left without much information about how long these talks are going on for, or when they are happening. This is once again because all of these ideas are in Lain's head, an entity separated from the viewer to an extreme amount. This once again contributes to her feeling deity-like to the viewer, but beyond that, she becomes for many an analog replacement of Jesus, but in the wired. A messenger spreading the gospel of God, but in reality that's agnostic to its real truth, in that the god of the wired is led astray by his ideals and Lain merely opposes him. Their relation in reality is closer to that of Lucifer and the Christian god. And Lain doesn't submit to the god's teaching. The god's transcendent values and their disregard for human life are what lead Lain to fear the god and question it further. All of this withholding the fear of a god we cannot see and Lain's silence against her own deification are all behaviors that work entirely differently in the show than they do in the Lain PS1 game. And the reason these behaviors differ so drastically across show and game has to do with how Lain was built in the first place.
Lain is a series which is artfully constructed as a demonstration of this Copernican revolution that is the internet age. something deliberately disclosed within its multimedia format with a show and its negative in an interactive game and multiple art books, a one-shot, and soundtracks and remix soundtracks released within its era and even to this day with the Siberia mixes. Much like the virtual networks of the Wired and the systems of memory data we are presented within the series, so too does Lain as a series operate within this production and the aesthetic thereof. And Chiaki J. Kanaka says as much, to immerse the viewer within the virtual world, within the experiences of Lain, and to understand and appreciate Lain through these various mediums. Within each, Lain assumes a very different character bound to different fates as it came about in production. For Lain as we understand it is not merely a character, as the result near the anime's finale unfolds for us.
All of these works are experiments which showcase different forms for the show's canon. And as my friend pointed out earlier, the PS1 game specifically is the negative of the main show. Everything the show refuses to give us about Lain, the game hands over directly. Instead of watching her from across an unbridgeable distance, you inhabit her, as the player controls a Lain avatar navigating a hierarchical file system on a company's servers, sifting through her own therapist's counseling sessions. Lain's own diary entries, video recordings and scraps of audio that are intentionally shown out of order. It's a feeling like trying to understand a person deeper, sitting where she sat, retracing a record of her own life on the network. And because the files are Lain's own preserved memory on the internet, you're actually kind of replaying Lain revisiting herself with the player standing in for her in the process. The most important part of that replay is what it leads to, because buried very deep in the game's strata, under conversations about Earl Grey tea and mundane life, is the death of both Lain and her therapist. It also differs from the Lain of the show, because instead of becoming one with the Wired organically, this Lain shoots herself in the head on a bridge. Her physical body dies there, but she goes on existing inside the network, and from it, she contracts her therapist, Toko, who shortly afterwards kills herself to join her. For me, the ending is perhaps the clearest moment that ties Lain to Cioran's philosophy, specifically to his argument about how one should die. Lain chooses the solitary death, he described, as the deepest and most organic. The gun, the bridge, with nobody to witness her. There's a strange logic in calling a suicide organic, but for Cioran what made the death organic was only its conditions. But the internet won't let her die. It refuses with ardor as it holds on to her memories and records. She goes on existing, and Toko goes on reading her files. You also end up reading her files. The very thing she tried to die out of becomes what makes her live. This is, in its own strange way, the opposite of what the anime has been arguing all along, and both works through opposite means arrive at the same claim about what Lain actually is. A work whose real subject isn't connection at the level of the internet, but something that predates the internet entirely. This is shown within the show's context through multiple things. Early on, it's well illustrated by the words Lain's father speaks to her, the premise of the plain language, primordial communication. Humans are connected and society moves between the real world and the wired. And this results in the concept of such connection to be treated almost with a liturgical quality. No matter where you go, everyone is connected. What drives coercion then? Is it not dread? And the sense of being acted upon by something distributed like a wheel. The connectivity of Lain is evocative in that way as a law of the environment. In real life, we see these connections as something positive, as something warm, a social ideal, but this idea gets subverted very easily within the show's rigid framework. By the time the series reaches its late layers, the show's theology becomes explicitly about human beings being connected at an unconscious layer, and the Wired is what represents the format which merges with that deeper layer of subjectivity. In layer 12, Lain says that humans have always been connected at the unconscious level, and that the Wired is only in the process of connecting to that fact, which reverses what I've stated above. It's not that we invented the internet of Lain is something that was already there inside us, a technology catching up to something humans have been doing with each other for as long as humanity itself has existed. The collective unconscious is a term best defined by psychologist Carl Jung. His version of the ideal collective acts very similarly to Lain's one. It's an idea that a psychic substrate has existed connecting humans since the beginning of all time. Lain herself also appears almost like the Jungian symbol of the divine child, an archetype representing figures of innocent power, which act both as messengers and disruptors of the world they inhabit. Although perhaps this is how I would read this, it's not how Konaka himself intended it to be. Konaka himself has said in interviews that Lain isn't purely a Jungian work, that he could just as easily have used words like Kabbalah or the Akashic record to describe the same idea. It's interesting because this means it's not really a set-in-stone ideal. The show is not using one rather than the other interpretation of connection, but rather all of them at once. My point isn't to argue which of these lenses is correct, but rather to affirm that Lain as a show believes the substrate that connects people to each other is universal across race, language, ideals, and almost everything. These concepts of connection being universal aren't really unfamiliar to me at all. If you remember, a while back I spoke on this channel about August in the Water. In that movie, a similar synthetic idea gets pushed forward, that humanity has been slowly becoming more and more connected because of alien interference. Because the ideal state of humanity is one without boundaries. Lain references this idea extensively throughout its runtime, but it takes until the later layers for the show to put the idea in its final form. Some episodes compress their entire thesis into a single line of dialogue, and layer 13 is the clearest example of that, with Lain telling us that it never happened if there is no memory of it, and that memory is just a record that can be rewritten. The show's ideals are fairly extreme. They basically say that a self is the information a person carries and the links that information makes with other people, and from that starting point, existence itself becomes a kind of social storage, a reality held together by nothing more than what enough people remember the same way. In that sense, identity is like a computer program, socially instantiated through the idea of godhood. Godhood in this case meaning having control over memory, over how others remember and name their own worlds and belief systems, and being able to rewrite all of that just like you would do to a text document. That's why Lain sacrifices herself, because she cannot picture a world where the body, the memories of a person, become so changed that the person loses themselves entirely. So she sacrifices that part of herself, giving up being remembered by others, giving up her own presence in the collective record, so that the lives of others aren't damaged by a reality whose past can be changed as easily as a text document.
Expanding from this separation of one's person then extends into a broader societal transformation occurring through the anonymous spaces of the Wired. Much of its activity centers around events that it exacerbates or causes in physical reality. In one interpersonal instance, we find Lain negatively affected by the actions of her other self in the Wired, as she leaks embarrassing personal information regarding her close friend Arisu. This acts as one cleaving between the barriers that vexes Lain herself and leaves her confused over her own nature. She appears as an alien to Arisu in her attempts to assuage her and to deny the Lain of the Wired as part of herself. By this point, Lain has been a phenomenon beyond her own character. Memory becomes an aberrant set of reflection, and with anonymity is amplified by the Wired. Lain steadily becomes more and more aware of the nature of her own consciousness as it reflects back onto her in the world of memory that is the Wired. In fact, this happened as soon as she first accessed the Wired. Ever-decreasing degrees of separation between the Wired and the physical realm are seen through the steady converging of the physical Lain and the Lain of the Wired. In this way, they fulfill a prophecy of the newly invented medium which humanity seemingly has been striving for. Eiri Misami's manipulations of Lain are the way by which he seeks to complete the system of the Wired, through the constant manufacture of the present. His philosophy is an echo of previous worldviews of human nature born from their respective revolutions of the conscious, a product of his generation. The idea that the simulation is or can be more real than the real is not at all new or unique, but another dictum of the ideas which drive out the responses of our consciousness. If the past is eternally invoked within the stream of information, and events can occur or be simulated as if they were the present, both the future and past become as if they were abolished.
There's a clear reason Eiri's ambition takes the shape of ideals of connection. He is someone trying really desperately to become God. Above being a really good hacker and scientist, he needs to have a concrete dogma and followers. The reason has to do with how groups of people constitute their gods in the first place. which is something Sigmund Freud specifically covered. In his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud states that groups don't really have a leader the way we usually think of leaders, with one strong person commanding all those below. Instead, groups actually have more of a shared ego ideal, which every group internalizes as their standard of their own selves. The leader of a group is whoever happens to most resemble the ego ideal that the group already has, and his power as a result comes from his resemblance to the idea of power already inside the people of said group. As such, a leader in reality isn't necessarily a leader, because outside the perception of those around him, he is nothing. A mere nobody that resembles nothing to people unaware of his figure. The moment people stop believing, he stops being the leader. The whole edifice relies entirely on this constant unconscious idea that is pushed by the believers themselves, who do it entirely subconsciously. Eiri Masami, above all else, is a leader more than a god. He only claims to be the god of the wild because of his influence as a hacker over the online space. He largely is a god because of the shattering reality, but still, how does he have just one set of believers? The knights are his most obvious disciples, but without them, his godhood would be lost in an instant. He'd be just a dead programmer whose consciousness someone uploaded onto a server. The god status is merely propagated by the group. As such, it is not his. He could never be a god. He's a real human being. He does not know the hardship of creation. He is the editor of reality, not the god. Konaka himself seems to know this well about him, because in interviews he has asked before whether Eiri's dogma is insane or merely misguided. Kind of a strange question to ask about a fictional character you wrote yourself, since you would think the writer of a character understands them best. It's just that the question makes most sense once you get Freud's idea, I've outlined above. Eiri is only real because his believers make him real. Both inside the show and outside it, the answer shifts on existence depending on who you ask. Just like those outside make up their gods based on this group identity, so those the show operate as such. Eiri is a complex character, so it makes sense his worldviews derived of humanity would invalidate his fragile godhood.
It also explains why he encourages Lain to erase other memories and erases and edits her own with it in every continuum. It's a wish to augment her, to change Lain and make her akin to him. Yet this does not change Lain herself at a base level. The Lain of the one-shot manga fails to pierce her awareness through the veil created for her by the God of the Wired due to her own emotional dependencies. So, the Lain in the show has her familial and personal dependencies rewired in her memory and erased. The Lain we see in the PlayStation 1 game comes to the conclusion that humanity has surpassed the body and chooses self-destruction. Chisa, in the very first scene of the show, follows this same trajectory in her stead. Though enmeshed with the spectacle produced within the history of the Wired, Lain still insists on the sanctity of her real self until she reaches either denial or synthesis, as we come to in the show through these factors.
This synthetic ideal, of course, has no basis in the real world, although it is based on reality to a fault, as the show likes to enforce the past as being part of our own real world. One of the most stunning parts of the whole ordeal is that even when doing a whole series analysis of Lain and looking through the lens of it being a phenomenon, you start noticing how its predictability gets enforced by the real world references. In the show's context, they are presented as if the viewer is being shown the provenance of the Wired, as if the Wired was part of our own reality. Almost like the way a religion might show the provenance of a secret text. The clearest case of that for me is found in Layer 9, because it does multiple things like that. It name-checks the Roswell UFO incident, Majestic 12, and then pivots into a lineage of information technology imaginaries. Vannevar Bush and the Memex, John C. Lilly and the Echo concept, Ted Nelson and Project Xanadu, the Schumann resonance, and Douglas Rushkoff as an emblem of 90s cyberculture theorizing. The references aren't decorative at all and all become relevant to the plot, from Bush's Memex being historically significant because of the concept of associative trails, a proto-hypertext model that explicitly imitates memories linking behavior, to the idea that these ideals might form the show's world's own Dead Sea Scrolls. In Lain's metaphysics, memory and linking are the whole engine that reality runs on, and that gives the framework a theological quality. Because theological systems are at their core rules about who gets to name what's real. The one who holds that record has the naming power, and as such becomes God. A god that the fanatics of The Wired, both inside the show and outside of it, spend their time reaching toward without ever quite arriving at. As such, a mixture of fact and fiction through anonymous mass information proliferation eventually becomes legend, and whether or not you can still tell which parts are which stops mattering, because the whole thing becomes valid information pointing toward the truth, or toward God, and is then reinterpreted into truth by God in much the same way that the Dead Sea Scrolls once were. Project Xanadu is presented in the show as one of the most important aspects of that document. It is a dream of a total documented universe, with visible connections and persistent structures which resemble Lain's Wired, far more than the fragile internet most people actually got in reality. Xanadu is the hope of all theological aspirations of network culture, a desire for a world whose meaning is literally the link.
This spectacle is something quite all-encompassing, to the point that invoking the idea of the spectacle itself became mere pastiche of the spectacle. An often cited philosopher who defined our formed idea of spectacle was of course Guy Debord, who in his time went on to see his own idea become responded to and even appropriated by others in this way. He was self-aware of this fact.
The individual who has been more deeply marked by this impoverished spectacle thought than by any other aspect of his experience puts himself at the service of the established order right from the start, even though subjectively he may have had quite the opposite intention. He will essentially follow the language of the spectacle, for it is the only one he is familiar with, the one in which he learned to speak. No doubt he would like to be regarded as an enemy of its rhetoric, but he will use its syntax. This is one of the most important aspects of spectacular domination success.
Lain's detachment of her own selfhood through the medium of the Wired is the way by which previous assumptions of our nature are broken down. Lain must confront the fact that the Lain of the Wired is different from the physical Lain, while both still being Lain. If she were to only take one, the other would be indiscernible to understand. Much as within Cartesian dualism, there are ways by which the mind and body are impossible to understand by the other, even though they must certainly interact with the other. The theme of the spectacle is important as the generation who will grow formed through the internet and on its terms. Within Lain, we even find the specter of Americanization and the expansion of the global village and its totalizing effects. The CIA are directly involved in watching over Lain almost immediately as she accesses the Wired. Lain itself was intended as a reaction to this globalization of culture, according to Yasuyuki Ueda.
They won't understand this. I don't want them to understand this. This work is based on the sensitivity and values of the Japanese people. America is different from Japan. This work itself is a sort of cultural war against American culture and the American sense of values we adopted after World War II. So I want American people to react to this work.
Heidegger, too, in the epigraph, was speaking within the context of Europe being caught between the rapidly modernizing America and Russia. In this rapidly forming global village from the radio to the internet, initial reactions by men such as McLuhan were positive, seeing it as something which would expand our freedoms as humans. Xanadu would be the completion of this. Some denizens of the Wired insist that this end goal would be freedom, because then their existence would be assured for eternity within the Akashic records of the Wired. They would never be forgotten as recorded history. All that remains is to drive our experiences quickly towards this realization, utilizing best of all the near instantaneous transmission of waves. Indeed, a significant factor of our experiences is that of time.
An invaluable resource which can be warped and changed theoretically. It is in fact a wave, one that some could call electromagnetic. In that sense, the concept turns inwards towards the concepts like the Schumann resonance, and by association enters the show's own mysticism of esoteric magic behavior, which has its basis in real-world science. The real Schumann resonances are measurable global electromagnetic resonances in the Earth ionosphere cavity. They are peaks excited by lightning discharges. This physical fact is used to speculate about the purpose of the unconscious synchronization and the networked mind, and is the basis of its internal logic. Layer 09 describes reality's susceptibility to informational infection as guesses became facts and rumors became histories. Lain creates a world whose information circulates through a strong enough reinforcement of real concepts. In that way, it manufactures the real. This may well be the only case I've ever come across where a diachronic story is built out of a synchronic field of science. Its attention to minute details is invoked in other works Konaka has written, like Ghost Hound, but none of them ever reached this level. And while all of the facts I've stated about these sentiments tend to get drawn back to the hyper-reality of the Lain anime, what's actually happening in the show is something much stranger than ever Baudrillard could have ever predicted. The strongest correspondence between these two you often see is the idea of the simulation theory, but that doesn't quite do it for me. Lain is by default Baudrillian because of its own formulation of the hyperreal, which Baudrillard famously condensed into a claim about models generating a real without origin. And his map theority motive turns into something especially usable for Lain, because the show stages a lot of moments where the concept of the map successfully overrides the territory through the network or internet. I think a lot about Baudrillard's predecessors who proposed similar ideas. Alfred Korbinski famously wrote that the map is not a territory, that what we treat as the world is really just its representation, and that the representation can, if we're not careful, replace the thing it represents in our thinking. This central concept is what most of the narrative turning points of Lain focus on. By extension, this makes the series derivative of the internet, not solely focused on the idea of the World Wide Web. And what I mean by that, and what I think a lot of people get wrong about the series, is that they simply assume Lain is a story inherently about the dangers of cyberspaces. They look at the object that is the map and think very clearly about the physical place within it, when in reality it's more a meditation coming from the early internet culture about database culture. Database culture is inherently an ideal derivative of digital culture theories. Out of those I can name as the earliest and most influential is Lev Manovich is one. He's one of the early theorists of new media who argued that databases and narratives form a key opposition in computer culture, and that at the level of material organization, many new media projects are databases even when they present themselves as narrative. It's just like Lain's ideas that all memory is a record. Since the record is editable, then therefore reality is a kind of database whose index is represented by the collective memory. Lain structure is a hyperstition, a term coined by the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit in the late 90s that describes a self-fulfilling idea, a fiction that becomes real through its own circulation and repetition. Hyperstition is what happens when an idea gets believed into existence, circulating widely enough and repeatedly enough that the belief itself creates the conditions for the thing to become truly real. It's what drove the creation of the Lain Phenomenon. It's what drove the mechanism of Lain and its entire afterlife to keep existing. If people act as though something isn't fiction, eventually that treatment will result in perception making it non-fiction. Which brings me back to a strange suspicion I've had all throughout all of this, that the Lain breakout was in a sense inevitable. Konaka wrote the show the way a conspiracy theory writer would write one, and as such every aspect of Lain feels like it needs to be dissected and discussed further. That's how the show spread on the internet, through video essays trying to make sense of it, and it's exactly what eventually led to the creation of Lainchan, the image board for all things Lain. In an almost quasi-religious way, the community began behaving obsessively with many of them, treating Lain as their way of living, their own flesh and blood, and across the years there were splits and infights over who was reading Lain correctly, each faction speaking a kind of private moral language that only made sense to them. These fights eventually produced a full-on betrayal when the site's original owner, Calix, sold Lainchan to another user named Appleman for $5,000, and on his way out deleted every board's content, which left the new owner with no backups and wiped years of community archives out overnight. The former staff split off and built a successor site in direct response, writing a founding statement that described the new project as a place under the faithful care of established community members, rather than simply the highest bidder. A site that could be trusted to continue the legacy of Lainchan as it was before. The last transfer of power. The old site got renamed Applechan within days by the Splinter community, a label used by people who were angry enough to want to strip the new leadership of any legitimacy, but not yet angry enough to fully let go of what they had built and lost. The sell-off is what someone who was there wrote about in an article called Chronicling Lain, written from the perspective of former staff, which describes a big shift in both thinking and user base that followed the transfer of ownership. Many people fled trying to rebuild their own legacy elsewhere, and others ran to different boards to complain that the community felt like it had woken up abruptly under a new sovereign entity. Yet another sign of the Wired's strange entanglements with the real world. It's almost like a miniature version of what happens in the show, with the fight for ownership and infrastructure. Out of what Lain-chan left behind, the Tsuki project began, born out of the wishes of chronically online insane people who were simply retreating further into themselves. A Lain-adjacent religion, a transfer of all systems and layers, was now being made real. The current surviving Tsuki front page states that system space contains many systems, including life, that an upgrade will purge the current system, and that migration is accomplished through registration, after which one may continue living but be evacuated upon death. While the site explicitly discourages suicide, it is simply the fear of suicide that drives those who engage with its morals to continue. I mentioned Cioran earlier in the context of his own philosophy on isolation and death, as well as his ideals of the lyrical mode. But something I didn't mention is that his own life ideals were indeed ones entirely derived from the concept of suicide. He states that man starts over again every day, in spite of all he knows, against all he knows. The fear of suicide is what drove Cioran to live. In his own words, if he were to ever stop and think about it, he would have committed suicide himself. Many people inhabiting that site were the exact same, and while Tsuki never directly advocated for suicide, there was a case where one of its members ended their lives, which eventually led to the shutdown of the website. The GitHub hosted compendium on their page reads like scripture, presenting a world of identities, authorities, unlinking procedures, and cosmological mechanism in the language of system design. All done in this weird psychiatric medication talk and under the guise of a metaphysical narrative. All this strangeness and popularity led to it being covered by Vice, which is worth looking into as well, because the article gives a contemporaneous account of how this internet religion presented itself to the public. How many of its followers claimed it offered them salvation and how difficult it was to verify the rumors of self-harm. In reality, the numbers aren't really known. We actually know less about the Tsuki project than about almost anything else.
Lain's experiential quality comes within the instantaneity of the Wired, of global internets. For people today, the internet is a core part of one's individuation as it becomes with Lain and how Lain becomes this for others. The structure of Lain is the most obscure aspect. Its digressions into history, conspiracy, and the interactions of the Wired come about dateless. Time rendered instantly dissolves into a slew of memory data. I want people to actually feel the girl Lain. And so, we experience the series with Lain, but not through her directly. In the game, we pick through her memories to piece together who she is by the interactions and events she describes or has with others. Lain is the principle by which the consciousness is permanently altered by the transmissions of the internet. It is not such a simple process as this linear detail, but a constant reverberation, even one beyond the series on its own. This is exactly Lainism. As a broader movement, its principal examples were not all sui generis, but something sprouted from the garden which Lain itself facilitated. And so, every person, every video, every interpretation, every analysis, everything over and about Lain becomes yet another doll by which those particular persons see Lain, and see themselves and the very nature of consciousness through Lainism.
And in a way, watching this whole phenomenon unfold has been the strangest part of making this video. Finding evidence online, outside of the show, that Lain has turned into an unstoppable force of reality was surreal. Maybe that's the only honest place to end up when writing a conclusion. With a feeling that whatever Lain was when it was aired in 1998, which it has become and continues to become now, in the slow accumulation of communities and websites and people who treat the internet as though it was the Wired, That is a thing the show somehow predicted, but was unable to prevent. Lain nowadays hangs around these websites, haunting them in our memory as a mere idea, an idea that refuses to become full reality, merely as the phenomenon of Lain. One thing is clear, however: this phenomenon is the closest representation we will ever have to the wild breaking out into the real world.